Okay, the guy with the back. With the TV, with the laptop already pulled in. All right, and then if you want to speak, you get it to be able to be heard online, yes. Therefore, you can.
I can just. See test. We're still getting set up, so we're probably going to start about 5 or 10 minutes late. We're in a interesting tech challenge here. I think I need to. Yeah, I think. Okay. Desiree, are you ready to hear me on the chat? Yeah, give me a second. Okay, go on here. Who do we have on participants? David.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to get started.
Yes, sir.
We're live streaming?
We are live streaming. This is our first in-person and joint CTE board meeting. So we're learning the technology. I wish I could learn how my computer turn off the sound, so I'm going to walk away from it for a second. So we do have a quorum, sir. We have 4 board members present. I know that Director Bracke is on her way and be here shortly. And then Director Zavarol and Director Kaufman are online.
Thank you. Is there anywhere we'll be able to see our online commissioners?
If I get some tech help, I can see them.
All right.
Why isn't this? Can you get the technical help though? I'm not able to get my.
Do you want me to get Jose? He might be able to.
We can go ahead and get started as working through the technical items because we have a big agenda. Do we want to do a formal roll call?
I think we have it. Like I said, Director Garcia is excused. He's at his daughter's graduation. Chairman Jones is here. Director Averill is online. Director Fromer is here. Director Brackey is not here, but will be here in a minute. She texted me and said she's on her way. Director Block is here. Shoshana is on maternity leave, and in her place, we have sort of acting director Sally Chafee. Director Blinn is excused. She's got a conference, can't be here, and Director Kaufman is online.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions? Does everybody have a chance to review the agenda? Any comment, or shall we proceed? Hearing none, we will move into our first action item of the morning. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to review the minutes. Any comments, revisions to the minutes?
I'd just like to correct for the record, my name's misspelled. It's one F, two E's in Chafee, if that could get updated.
We'll fix that ASAP.
Appropriate correction. Do I hear a motion to approve with corrections? All right. Commissioner Block moved to approve with corrections.
I'll second.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. All right, motion passes. Next is public comment. Do we have anybody who's signed up for public comment?
I did have one. Is Andy online? If you want to unmute yourself. I'm a little worried about how the technology of this will work. Did you get one this morning as well? Okay, the gentleman from Grand Valley had requested public comment. Hopefully we haven't bounced him out for technical reasons. If he shows up, I suggest that at some point we can acknowledge him and just give him time to speak then.
That makes sense to me. All right, moving forward. Craig, public program administrator update.
Yeah, I don't really have much other than I think I will never ever schedule 2 board meetings within 3 weeks again. Mostly it's really just been preparing for this meeting and working on the apportionment formula. I did present at the CASTA conference, and I'm going to show some of the information I shared today. Everyone in the state seems to be very excited about this program and looking forward to it. But again, given the short duration since the last board meeting, I thought I'd just kind of, I didn't really have too much else to share.
All right, I think you really want to focus most of our time on later agenda items is what's happening. All right, next we have director comments. This is time for any directors to bring up any items that they're wanting us to either discuss briefly or entertain for a future agenda item. Hearing no comments from any directors, we will move forward into SB 230 program formula discussion for 60 minutes. I'm going to start my timer now.
It doesn't seem to want to turn off.
The folks online still here? Thumbs up, because I just muted your microphone. Can folks online still hear us?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think you just had speakers, sound coming out of your speakers.
Okay, thank you. It's good not to hear that. Okay, so the big focus today is to see if we can get to a decision on the apportionment formula, which will be a major milestone in the SB 230 program setup. And I think if we can go from the meeting at the end of January, where we first talked about what was even in the bill, to a big policy decision like how the money gets divided up, and I think for all of us, it'll be something to really feel good about. So I just thought I'd take a few minutes to just talk about where we've kind of gone in that 5 months. So, first of all, the first meeting in January, we set up program goals. We've done some definition about eligibility for the program. I think one of the most important ones is deciding that the program will only be focused on open door providers. We've worked with what was provided in the legislation in terms of formula factors and kind of defined them and figured out how to turn them into the formula. And then we've taken those factors, collected data, and put them into the model. And my consultant Cameron here is the sort of gerbil behind the scenes who's really done an amazing job creating a tool that allows us to pretty easily look at a lot of different formula approaches and get to, I think, some viable options. We've also established a 3-tier approach where, realizing that you can't really have RTD, RAFTA, and La Junta sort of competing against each other just because of the magnitudes of scale are so disproportionate. I think we've decided to essentially create 3 sub-programs where there's RTD by itself, that's kind of a negotiated share, and then a large agency program and a small agency program, with the differentiation be that smaller agencies are those that have ridership under 30,000 a year. And that was mainly when you looked at sort of the break of the agencies, it just seemed to be a natural departure point. And so I think there's somewhere around 35 agencies in the large program and somewhere 15 to 20 in the smaller program. But I think we've decided on that as a meaningful structure for doing the formula. We also introduced, in last month, we introduced this concept of creating a cap on how big an agency's grants could be. So this is, for a couple of reasons. One is just we were seeing some really odd results in terms of a few agencies, by nature of the factors legislation required, got really disproportionate allocations. So we had agencies getting like 70 or 80% increase in operating funding compared to their FY3 budget. So in addition, there's concern that because of the variability or potential variability of the funding source, the concern about having agencies have a large portion of their operating budget relying on SB 230, and then a year or two down the road, we have a big drop in funding, and suddenly we've created unsustainable funding, sort of funding scenario for a lot of the agencies. So I kind of got to this idea that a 20% cap, at least for the first year, provided a kind of good, fair way to make sure, or a way to make sure that we're providing sort of a fair distribution of funds, not creating these anomalies and not creating these threats. And so when you apply that cap, and again, the data that we're using is FY23 because that's the most latest year that's published in National Transit Database. You largely end up with agencies getting between your 10 or 20% grant, or their grant is about 10 to 20% of their FY23 operating budget. And so it's kind of helped us get I think the model working much better. And then lastly, I think the last meeting we agreed that at some point we'd like to try and build a contingency fund so that that if we do have a year where there's a big downturn, we've got some reserves that we can take to kind of keep the distribution smooth. So I don't think we want to do that in FY26 because of the reduced funding. But as we move forward, we can build that into the model of pulling some money aside that we can hopefully use to address volatility. I guess before, I just want to make sure all the board members agree that we've pretty much agreed on those things up to this point, and that's where we're moving forward from. I think it's an important baseline.
Thanks, Craig. Any questions or comments on where we've come in the past 5 months? All right, let's proceed.
I don't want to go through these, but the whole part of the formula is like we're trying to figure out how we address these goals and balance against these goals. So I thought it was worthwhile just quickly remembering, what we're trying to do here. And again, that the overarching goal is greenhouse gas reduction. That's what provides us the nexus with the oil and gas production fee. And it's important that we keep the money focused on achieving that goal so that we are consistent with the goals of the enterprise. At the same time, we're trying to balance, and there may be some tension here, but we're also trying to make sure we're doing as much as we can to improve the quality effectiveness of transit services and achieve a balance of helping the full diversity of transit agencies across the state. And then, the other stuff is more, we're focused, we want to make sure we're doing this in a transparent way. I think the formula very much helps that. It's a pretty good scientific, transparent approach so that it's defensible in what we're doing. And then I said, just the last one there is, I think the contingency addresses this need to manage and minimize the impacts. So like I said, I think we're doing a good job kind of keeping on track of balancing against the goals that we've set for the program. Okay, so the formula options development. Just to kind of some observations as I've played with the formula tool, and some of the board members I've shown it to, and you've got a chance to play with it and see it. I said it's a pretty robust tool that we've developed, and I think it's doing a good job. I would say the grant cap, while generally it works really well, it will occasionally have some interesting impacts, because if an agency is capped, it sort of takes money and can put it in some weird places. So that was one thing we just kind of realized, that sometimes it can have some unintended consequences. On the other hand, we've sort of inadvertently created an incentive for local agencies to increase their contribution to operating budgets, because if an agency is capped, every dollar more that they put into operating will in essence increase their cap, and they get $1 more out of the formula. So and that's more that will kind of happen down the road. But you said, I'm not sure we intended this, but it actually I think is a pretty good outcome, is the caps really help key to an incentive for agencies not only to maintain their effort, but continue to put in more of their own share. I also feel like using this percent of agency's budget as or the grants, looking at grants as a percentage of an agency's operating budget, provides some means to see like how fair are we being across all these agencies. We do get some odd things where there's some agencies that have extremely high or comparatively high costs, like ridership to dollars, or vehicle revenue miles to dollars. That's some of the resort areas, I think, just have more funding and their operations are a little unique to transit. But outside of those, we're generally able to keep agencies within this band of really about 12% to 20% increase. And so I think you can make an argument that we're pretty evenly, we're pretty consistent in terms of the level of assistance we'll be giving to each agencies, at least in the first year. Right now, there's 52 agencies in the model. Those are primarily the agencies that currently receive FTA 5311 or 5307 funds. There's a few more that are in there. It's possible that others may be both interested in the program and eligible. But if so, I don't think that's really going to be a problem for today. Those agencies are most likely going to be on the smaller side. Their grants are not going to be huge. And so when you allocate that over 52 agencies and $38 million, the impacts will be kind of de minimis. So I said, I feel pretty good that we've gotten just about every transit agency that's potentially eligible in there. But if we didn't, that's okay. It's not going to, we're not going to end up, it's not really going to change the outcomes very much. And I would say, as I was running different scenarios, and we're going to go through those in a second, you really don't see a huge change in the funding. In large part, the biggest impact is you're shifting money between the resort agencies and the small urban areas, and most of the other agencies sort of stay pretty consistent. I'm not surprised by that when you look at the factors that the legislature gave us: population density, ridership. Those all tend to kind of go in the same direction. So shifting the weighting from them still ends up with pretty similar differences. The vehicle revenue miles, that's one's a little bit different. That often can provide some greater benefit to the rural areas. Some of the rural areas have really high vehicle revenue miles. And then the zoning and the zoning and the transportation disadvantaged communities. Again, it's a little bit of an odd impact sometimes, because a lot of those agencies are already kind of maxed out on what they get when the cap. So if you put a lot of emphasis, say, to the transportation development communities, places that you would think would do really well, like Greeley or Pueblo, are already receiving that 20% cap. And so the money goes to like Snowmass and Breckenridge, which I don't think, nothing against those agencies, but isn't really the intent of that. So again, just some quirkiness of, sort of our first year experience with the modeling. Generally, it works pretty well, but there are some glitches in there. and we'll have to see how we feel about them. So rather than, opening up the model and trying to do some sort of process, sausage making process in public, I thought the best approach would be to develop a couple different scenarios that the board could take a look at, see the implications of the different scenarios, and then we can weigh in and see what you think and whether there's something that you want to try and approve today, or whether we need to do some more adjustment. And I want to welcome Director Brockie. We're just getting into the formula. Director Frommer.
We have like 50 of them. Okay.
As I said, we're still working out the technical aspects.
All right. Whoa. Okay. Yeah, I had a question about how you're classifying different transit agencies. So Craig, when you say small urban, is that basically any like MPO transit agency outside Denver?
It's a great question. The answer is a little bit murky because so first of all, RTT Denver is pretty clear and straightforward. Rural is pretty straightforward. Rural resort, and I'm going to take a broader answer than what we just asked. Rural resort is clear in some cases where, like a Breck Ride or Winter Park, they're clearly tied to resort. Somewhere like Estes Park, is that a resort? RAFTA is both resort and kind of regional. And then small urban, there's a designation with FTA for small urbans where they're getting funds. However, I took it a little more broadly as to just think of sort of the agencies that are considered all small urban, but maybe are just also agencies that are decent, or sorry, service areas that are a decent size. So I'm trying to think where I put Durango in there. They're not a small urban, but they're a decent sized community. And I said, so it's messy trying to come up with that categorization is my point. But I thought it's really meant to just provide a sort of pretty sort of broad picture of where's the money going. I mean, there's always the question about what's going to the Front Range versus the rest of the state. What's going to, normally you would just worry about that, but because of the difference between true rural agencies and rural resort agencies, it felt like we needed a differentiation there. And then again, because of RTD being sort of the 800-pound gorilla, we wanted to separate out them from other areas. So that was an effort to just think, if you think of sort of almost sort of the nature of transit agencies, rather than sort of the official designations, I think that the approach we used, works okay. Other questions about the methodology? I'm going to get into some of the actual scenarios now. Sorry, let me go into the first one here. Wait a minute, sorry. Actually, just some big picture things. So this really just is sort of those broader decisions we made about creating 3 programs. So, essentially, if you take the first year money, the 38 million, we think we've got an arrangement with RTD where we're just simply going to cap the amount in FY26 at 9 or 25%, or about $9.5 million. And then, the rest would go to the other programs. And then really, when I looked at like the large and small programs, I looked at what it would take to get the agencies in the small programs in that sort of comfort band of 10 to 20% or 12 to 20% increase in operating budget. And that got me to about $1.5 million. And then the remainder of the money is what goes into the large programs. So that's how we got to the 3 tiers. And I do think when we actually do the NOFA and go out, it's the small agencies where we may or may not have them participating. It's hard to imagine some, the bigger agencies are not going to be going for it, but that remains to be seen. The other chart there is really just want to show that, the by and large, the most money here is going towards on our fixed route services. There are some rural agencies who only have on demand. We want to help them. But, you know, it's really a small percentage of this funding that will go to on-demand. And I think there even is a case to be made for a lot of those on-demand services that while the service themselves may not be really helping greenhouse gas, they might even, you know, really be adding VNT, but they're enable connections to things like bus staying, you know, which do sort of help VMT reduction. So, you know, if someone can take the bus from Alameda to La Junta and then take the last mile with the on-demand service, that's enabled them to avoid that trip driving. So, you know, I think something to keep in mind that, you know, I think we are, when you look at that allocation, we're really doing a good job about getting as much of the funding towards things that are going to help greenhouse gas reduction. Also, when we go to 27 and the funding increases after Prop 117 comes off, you know, that percentage of on-demand only probably decreases quite a, you know, to like more like 2 or 3%.
Craig, I have a question, and it's more about future planning. If small agencies don't look at the amount of funds that are available to them as worth the squeeze in the first round, and there's monies that then don't get allocated to small agencies, in future year budgets, will we be setting aside whatever wasn't used for that size of agency and up the size of the bucket, or does it go, do you envision it going back to the general formula allocation and just a bigger budget for all the buckets?
Good question. I think for this first year, what we could do is sort of like lock the allocations based on the formula. And if we have agencies that end up not participating and some extra money left over, you know, perhaps we just use that to start building that contingency. Now, I don't think it's going to be that much. It's, you know, a few $100,000, you know, $1 million at the most. But rather than trying to, you know, go back and basically mess up our contracting process, we got to change numbers. I'd rather sort of freeze the numbers, and if some don't apply in the first year, we start building that contingency. But it's not going to be, you know, I think that's going to be less than $1 million. You know, in the future, I think, you know, again, we're going to learn a lot this first year. We are, you know, we expect to make some changes, I think, for FY27. And I think we'll have to see where we are. You know, we may decide that, yeah, you do have to do, you know, if for some reason, you know, I don't know, say RTD says they don't want the money, that's a lot of money laying around. And then, yeah, I think we would reallocate it in 27. You know, we're continuously appropriated, so I don't think the money is at risk of lapsing if it doesn't get issued out in contracts. It's really a matter of once the money's under contract with a given agency, the agency has 2 years to spend it. So the point being is if we did have more money than we thought left over for FY26, we could roll it in FY27 grants, and the agencies would still have 2 years to spend it. Any questions? Other questions? And someone's monitoring the, there, okay. Okay, I know this probably doesn't pass the accessibility test, but there's really no way to do that. But I'm not going to do this for all the different scenarios. You really don't see that much change. But this is the large program, so all the large agencies, and it's just meant to give you some order of magnitude of how much the size of the grants the agencies might be getting, and you know, how they compare across to each other. So, you know, as you'd expect, the agencies that are the small urban areas and the agencies that have the higher ridership numbers, you know, they're the ones that are seeing really the big numbers. And then as you get down into some of the, you know, the smaller agencies where their ridership is 100, 200,000, you know, they're down in below $1 million in annual grants. And then here's the different scale, but this is just kind of what it looks for the small agencies. And as you'll notice, on the large agencies, you saw some big differences between FY26 and 27 as the additional funding kicks in. Here, I think just all the agencies are getting the same amount in 26 and 27, and that's essentially because of the cap. However, when we go and run the 27 numbers, we'll have new data for what the agencies are spending, you know, what their operating budgets were for 24, and we probably will see a little bit of difference. But this is kind of just based on the data we have now. And again, it's just meant to give you a sense of order of magnitude and the relative size of funding between different agencies. Okay, so I'm going to go through these different scenarios that we've come up, and I've given them some names. This I'm calling the balanced approach. So, and this is we're pretty much balancing the emphasis on population-related factors with ones that are more based on, sort of historical transit performance data, like ridership and revenue miles. And then we're giving the other factors like transportation to disadvantaged communities, local zoning, and population density, kind of a lower score. And in reality, the density is sort of in there with the population. And I said, this is trying to balance what I think are really the two big factors in the process. And as I said, the population, transit ridership, and vehicle revenue miles are really, are good, strong factors in data. But, the information is readily available. It's been vetted and documented with the, largely by the National Transit Database process. And it's pretty easy to get your hands around and understand. The other three factors are a little, I think the confidence of them is a little lower, and they're a little squirrely. I think I've talked to most of the board members about this, but population density sounds like an easy thing to calculate. But when you get into the complexity of identifying a transit agency service area, and then the population that's associated with that, and figuring out where their routes are, you end up having some real strange outcomes, just based on the characteristics of the area. So, I feel like if density was really important for us, we'd have to do a lot more analytics and really get into, questions about looking at how, what the density is in close relationship to the actual routes. I don't think it makes that much difference in the formula relative to the population. So I don't know if it's really worth the squeeze to spend a lot of energy there. But again, I wouldn't put a ton of weight on the density because of, I think, some of the issues in coming up with the data related to it. Local zoning and planning is again, it's a great idea to have it in there, but figuring out how do you come up with a scale or way to compare 52 different transit agencies, which represent all kinds of different communities and values and things like that. How do you come up with a common scale for comparing them? What we have right now is just what I would call a pretty soft approach. I just went through and gave them a ranking to get through this part. As part of the NOFA, we are going to do a questionnaire and ask the agencies, are you doing any of these different things like complying with House Bill 1313, which allows high zoning in transit areas? Are you involved in the Colorado Transit Asset Management Plan? Have you done an EV plan? But we can kind of come up with a laundry list of things that people will look at, can check the box on, and then allow them to provide a narrative. And then I think we'll set up a panel, and it will arguably be a subjective rating. Director Kelly isn't here today, but she expressed some concern about using that as a factor and was wondering if we don't want to just essentially zero it out for this year and try and deal with it in future years. I think there's an argument for that. I also feel like the legislature gave us that as a specific factor. We've come up a way to use it. And to be honest, I ran some scenarios where I zeroed it out. It really doesn't change things that much if you use it. So it's kind of innocuous, but it's also admittedly imperfect. The transportation disadvantaged communities piece, where we looked at things like elderly, disabled, people of color, low income, and households without income. Ran into some of the issues with density with identifying service areas, but we were able to create an index for it. And I think if you go and look at the index and give a gut check of like who should be high and who should be low, it kind of worked. So that one I actually have a little bit more confidence in. But again, giving it a lot of the weight in the model has some issues. Anyhow, so I want to just give a little bit more detail on that. So on the balanced approach, back to the balanced approach, what I looked at, about 30 of the 52 agencies actually hit their cap in this approach. There's 5 agencies that get less than 10%, which again, that's sort of arbitrarily has kind of become my test for fairness. But when I looked at like the reason for that is that these were agencies that had, like I said, very high relationships between, dollars per rider or dollars per population or dollars per vehicle revenue miles. So they were kind of outliers in the group in terms of their cost and other considerations. point, and I think when you look at the size of the grants that they're getting, they're actually still pretty good sized grants. So you know, again, once I looked at the rationale there, didn't feel like something was wrong there. And again, I think that this balanced approach, it helps everyone across the state. You know, the percentage of their operating budgets are all in a pretty nice tight group. I do think it gives a little bit of an advantage to the some of the small urban providers compared to some of the other approaches. So let me get through the 4 approaches, I think, and then we can have a discussion. And actually, technically, there's 5, because I thought I should just run one where I got rid of the cap and saw what it did. And so this is basically the balanced approach, but rather than the cap being 20%, I just set it at 100%. So it didn't really catch anyone. And again, you get some really strange results. You got agencies that are only getting a 4% increase in their operating budget, and agencies that are getting an 85% increase. The agencies that had high ridership ended up getting like significantly less funding for some reason. It sort of directed money to these agencies that are kind of in like the bottom tier of that large agency group. And generally, I think, you know, it kind of emphasized to me why the cap actually worked, because it really was probably the scenario that provided the least greenhouse gas reduction, and just wasn't going to agencies where we think there's really going to be the biggest differences made. So then I did one that emphasized population. So you'll see population and density combined are 60%, ridership and vehicle revenue miles are about 30%, and then we just kept local zoning and TDCs at 5% each. Not surprisingly, this moves money kind of from the resort areas to the small urbans. But it's not a ton of money. It's really only about $1 million that's getting moved one way. You know, the cap kicks in, so it does reduce, you know, some of the agencies that might do a bit better get you know, affected by that cap. The impacts on some of the small agencies was really pretty minor, and some of it just was a little bit random. I couldn't really figure out some of the reasons why certain agencies popped up in their funding or dropped in the funding, but you know, it was really at the margins, like probably around, you know, plus or minus 5%. And again, I think that this, it felt like there was still really good equal treatment across the scope of agencies or range of agencies. But it, you know, presumably, you know, you do have more money going to places like Colorado Springs and Fort Collins. And so I think, you know, again, it probably has the strongest greenhouse gas reduction impact of any of the scenarios we're looking at. So then I flipped it and went the other way. And it's like, rather than emphasizing population, let's focus on transit ridership and vehicle revenue miles. And it had pretty much the opposite impact as the population focused. It moved money from the small urbans to the resorts. Most of the agencies in the middle really weren't affected. And that's kind of what I really learned with the model is ultimately it's the battle is between the resorts and the small urbans. And again, we don't expect to see as much greenhouse gas reduction benefits from the resort areas. So, you know, and this is a pretty soft assessment at this point. I don't have hard data behind it, but you know, that's the main difference is this approach. You know, said look, and I think the other issue with this is that when you're looking at ridership and vehicle revenue miles, you're sort of looking backwards because it's, you know, we're using 2023 data looking at, you know, kind of how they performed. Whereas population, I think you're looking more at sort of opportunity and market potential. So I think that's just one consideration as to which is more important, you know, looking backwards or looking at opportunity. Okay, and lastly, I tried other factors where, you know, again, I kept kind of took weighting away from population and transit ridership and vehicle revenue miles and gave high weightings to transportation disadvantaged communities, local zoning and planning, and density. And, you know, quite frankly, the results were really weird. And when I looked at it, I think really the reason is you know, those areas that we're trying, you know, you'd want to be getting funding to in transportation disadvantaged communities is a focus. they're already capped out. So I said, it just took that money and kind of put it in weird places. And so, I said, I think Breckenridge and Snowmass were like the big winners. Love those agencies, nothing against them, but I don't think, a approach where you're trying to get money to transportation disadvantaged communities aligns with something that sends that money. Really, I think if we wanted to get funding to some of those transportation disadvantaged communities or increase it, I think we need to look at some kind of like waiving the cap or doing something along those lines, as opposed to trying to do it through a weighting approach. So that's, let me see what we got left here. So here, it might be easier to see on on screens than the online here or the presentation. But I tried to just provide some means of comparison. And really what you'll see is, I gotta remember which is which, is orange is the small urbans and red is the rural transit agencies. And, for the most part, we're moving $1 million back one way or the other with the formula. And the other thing I would say is with the smaller funding in FY26, things are a bit constrained. I think when we go to FY27 next year, we'll have more recent data about agencies' operating budgets and their performance. I don't think we'll see as many agencies getting caught by that cap, and the formula will actually be a little bit more impactful. In some ways, I think if the legislature hadn't given us those factors, we might have just looked at % of operating budget and been done. But, it's kind of, it's an odd way that's become as important a factor as the other things that are in the legislation. So, all right, you've had to weather me trying to explain these different approaches. Why don't I open it up to the board? I'm kind of interested to hear from each board member about what they think and where they're inclined.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for all the hard work to you and Cameron. Building a model like this is no small task in a short amount of time. So really appreciate everything that's gone into this for our consideration. Do directors have any maybe questions first that might help clarify before you provide comment on where the work has led so far? Director Frommer?
Yeah, just want to echo Chair Jones's thanks to you and the modeling team. It's really cool. A question about the density factor. Just thinking about agencies on the western slope, like what are the boundaries for a transit agency like RAFTA? Is it like the whole county, even though the population's pretty focused along the highway corridor there?
I think it's a pretty gray area, to be honest. Some agencies are like they're a county. So, you take the whole area of the county, but the transit service is actually just on one corridor. I don't know that there's hard set rules about how you do it. I'm not as familiar with the National Transit Database rules as I should be, perhaps, but, they require agencies to report the population they serve, and presumably that must get into some geographic boundaries. But my sense is it's pretty murky. Yeah, like I said, you have someone who has a nice tight, a town where they provide service, it seems, and everyone's within 2 miles of the transit service. That works pretty well. Then you have other agencies where, particularly a county level agency or a regional level, where their defined area is huge, but maybe of the population that they serve, only about 20% of it is within 5 miles or 2 miles of the transit service. So the problem is like how you define that is pretty tough. And then also is I worry about us having a factor in there or having an approach where we're treating different agencies differently. So yeah, for agencies that are MPOs, they're in MPOs, there tends to be a lot more data, and the tracks that you look at are a lot smaller, and it's kind of made to be able to do that type of analysis. But when you get into the rural areas, you can't. And so, how do you deal with a factor where you have to apply it very differently across different agencies? And I think that's sort of the inherent challenge with it.
I saw Director Averill's hand.
Okay, I
that
think
went
Director
down.
Brockie did too, so.
Oh, sorry. Well, Director Averill's hand went down, so, but his mic is now unmuted. So maybe Director Averill and then Director Brackey.
Yeah, I was just to speak to Director Froner's question, about RAFTA. I can't speak exactly on the boundaries, but like our organization, SMART, we serve portions of 5 different counties, but not those entire counties. And those are service areas, but not necessarily where we collect taxes. Our core jurisdiction is where we collect taxes, and even that's not even the entire county. So it's totally across the board. And I think Craig's done a pretty good job at trying to wrangle it because it is with RTAs, particularly in the resort areas, it's a total hodgepodge, just kind of organic growth, if you will. But
Director Brackey.
Sure. So, with the first step and the reason I brought in, the sort of decision science guys is, yeah, it's a very disparate group of data, and you got to figure out how do you get that into, sort of an apples to apples when, they didn't give us apples and oranges. They gave us apples and like light bulbs. So, and so, really what you had to do first is to get to some comparative quantitative scale for everything. Okay, for ridership, you've already got it. You can see you've got 3% of the state's ridership. Same thing for vehicle revenue miles. Population was a little, more complex because you have transit agencies that share the same populations. But really, we were able to just kind of work with that and essentially created an index where we just took each agency's population and saw where it was in this kind of compared to other agencies. Population size, and we're able to translate that into an index. So we weren't just dividing, if RTD is 2.7 million people, I'm using that as an example, but and they're not really in the formula, but divided by the state's population, that wouldn't really work because, some of RTD service population is in Boulder and, other places. So again, we just basically took the relative size and we're able to create an index for that factor. For the local zoning, I said basically we created a 5-point scale and just said here's where we think agencies are in terms of how transit friendly their zoning and planning practices were. And again, I need data to actually do that for real. For purposes of getting to the model at this point, I just kind of went through and, places like Boulder or R5, they've got all kinds of planning and zoning, transit-friendly practices. Rural areas presumably don't so much, but they've maybe done some really good local planning in that. So, you could kind of give, again, it's going to be a subjective test. When we get to down the road a little bit and like the local, what do they call it, the community centers program is up and running and you can identify agencies have like a community center or don't, we may be able to get to a more robust scale, but for right now it's pretty soft and it has to be pretty subjective. I don't know how else we get there. I was just interviewing fellows and we asked them that question and they didn't know the answer. So let's see, that's local zoning. The population density, again, like we just got weird results. Like Boulder had double the density of anyone else. Like, I don't know, and maybe. And really what I backed from was like, really taking these numbers as is, where you take the service area, again, however you define it, by the population that's defined for that area, and you get 12,000 people per mile is Boulder, 6,000 for Denver. I was like, these are not really readily comparable because there's got to be a lot of noise in there. So instead, I just said, well, let's really just generalize this, set tiers, use the data that we have, but make it a pretty soft scoring approach. So again, I used a 1 to 5 scale, similar to the local zoning, and we just set tiers. So I think it was if you were over 4,000 people per square mile, that was a 5. 2 to 4,000 was a 4. I think 1 to 2 is 3. So it's a little bit of a exponential scale. But again, it was able to look at like, where there were reasonable breaks to create those tiers. But essentially, used data that was so-so and then came up with a pretty broad scoring approach that translated into a 5-point scale. And then transportation disadvantaged communities, we were able to get data from local fairs on all the different demographics. Same issue, we had to overlay it by the transit service area. But based on that, we're able, look at the percent of population that was people of color, or percent that was disabled. And then we were able to translate that into an index. And I said, I would have been more nervous about that. But then when you looked at the outcome, I think Pueblo had the highest score. Places like, with large farm populations like Greeley, they came out pretty high. I think Crested Butte had the lowest. Some of the resort areas were pretty low. And I said, I kind of gave it a gut test, and I'm like, yeah, it works. We could probably improve it. And again, as we get better at defining service areas, but it sort of worked. So anyhow, that's sort of the nuts and bolts behind it. Is that enough, or is there other?
Yeah, that's really helpful for me. Thank you.
Good.
And I think helpful probably for others as well. So I appreciate you explaining that, and we've got to work with the data that we have. And it sounds like you've done a good job trying to make that work, and then again, gut check the results is helpful. And I also want to say I appreciate the visualization of the data. I think that's helpful for us as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Director Brecky. Your mic was not working on the question. And folks online did not hear. Do you mind just repeating it for the record?
Sure. So my original question was if describing more around the specific methodology for population and those other factors. So thank you.
Thanks. No, that was a spare. Are there any other questions from directors?
I do, please. Thank you.
Director Buck.
I too want to thank the time that you guys have put into this. What a project. I appreciate Craig taking the time to sit down last week with me and show me the hard numbers and how that formula works. I appreciate the fact that you have taken rural agencies into account. That seems to be pretty normal as far as the distribution. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Director Frommer.
Yeah, thanks. My one other question is that I know some of these factors were in legislation in Senate Bill 230, I think with the word shall. So are we allowed to zero out any of these, at least temporarily, or we have to at least assign like 1%?
I don't really know the answer to that. I guess you could say, yeah, we looked at the factor but gave it 0. My sense is, particularly because we're in this sort of starter year, that's showing good faith that, yeah, we found a way to, integrate all these in there without, again, I think we found a way to do it without creating some really ugly child kind of approach. So personally, I would just advocate, I think being able to go back to reports to the legislature and said, yeah, we took it seriously. We honored the letter of the law, and we incorporated everything in there. Did we do it at 1%? Yeah, I could. I kind of feel like 5% is sort of like the, sort of the floor for saying we treated it real. But again, it's up for the board, I think, to decide that. I would advocate that we just, those ones that we don't feel as good about, we use them, but we don't give them a huge weight. And that's what I've really done in most of these scenarios.
I would agree with that. And I do think we have to follow the legislative intent, and so zeroing out would not make me very comfortable. But I'm curious, Craig, kind of these 4 approaches, if you have any recommendations, or you're leaning anyway in towards of what might be the most fair approach as we enter this.
Sure. I think I've made it clear. I think the other factors approach just doesn't work. It's just, you're not getting the outcomes that you're trying to with giving it that weighting. I think all of the other 3 are viable. But I believe that I think the one with the slight population emphasis, so the one in the upper right quadrant there, I think it does the best job at giving us an equitable distribution of funding across all the agencies while still giving a nod to the greenhouse gas reduction purpose, and so doing a little bit more to help those agencies set up more transit services, which we think are going to lead to greater greenhouse gas. So, you know, if I had my druthers, I would push the board towards the population emphasis approach. I think the balanced approach is probably the second best one. And then I think the historical performance one is, which is really moving money from the local, from the smaller urban areas to the rural resorts. Love the the resort areas, but you know, they tend to be pretty strong financially as it is. And I'm not sure we get the same greenhouse gas reduction.
All right, any more questions from directors before we get into, first we have Andrew Gingrich for public comment, and then we can get into discussion on our sentiments and feelings on the direction this is headed.
Sure. Can you let Andrew in and do it?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
you all can hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Had some tough technical issues at the beginning here. It actually worked out because my comments were kind of related to this item and kind of doing my best with looking at the agenda packet ahead of time. So hearing Craig's overview is helpful and addressed a lot of my comments. So I'll try to just wanted to follow up from my comments at the last meeting. There was a letter from my board, the GVRTC. Just wanted to confirm that those were received. And really the crux of that was again pointing out the opportunity that small urban, and by that I mean, I guess, small FTA, small urban communities would have in this program. And I think Craig said it kind of set the dynamic of looking forward versus looking backward. And I was thinking about that in terms of, you know, is it the transit propensity versus, I guess, the past performance or those systems that are already developed. And it's very difficult to create a formula that addresses the different various agencies. Economies are different, revenue streams are different, and land uses are different for sure. And cities like Grand Junction have done a lot recently to promote infill, to try to not get a dynamic where we have our workforce far away from their job locations, try to keep that VMT lower by building in a more compact infill kind of way. And that was the emphasis of the letter as well. So yeah, just wanted to again emphasize this opportunity. I think that the population emphasis scenario speaks more to the transit propensity and the potential rather than looking backward. And I guess I did have just one specific question about the FY 26 and 27 bar chart about why some agencies see an increase in 27 versus 26. And I had a lot of other thoughts there, but I think that Craig's presentation touched on a lot of them. But that's, I guess, where I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Craig, do you want to respond to any of the question in that, or directors want to ask any questions of Andrew or Craig?
Sure. I think we don't normally do direct question response, but it's an easy question. I'm happy to. You know, part of the reason for the changes in 26, 27 is just the amount of funding goes up significantly. In FY 26, we've got the Prop 117 cap hitting us. So we think that the funding that's going to be available for the formula program is about $38 million. In FY 27, the amount of funding available goes from, you know, to the full amount, which we think is going to be, for the formula, we think is going to be about $80 million. So part of that drives the changes in FY 27. Similarly, RTD said is in for sort of a small amount in, I think, by their standards, for FY '26. But we're assuming that FY '27, they'll be brought up to a higher number and will absorb a good amount of that additional funding that comes in by the cap going away. We don't know exactly what that agreement's going to be yet, so there's some variability in there. The third I would know is that some agencies end up with the same amount of money in FY '27, '26, as '26, and others have an increase. Generally, the agencies that are not getting an increase, that's really because the cap is kicking in, so they're just sort of capped at both years. That said, the FY '27 data is really illustrative. We don't have the data to run the numbers now. We know that a lot of agencies have both increased their operating budgets in FY '24, and perhaps have higher ridership or things. So for a variety of reasons, those results that we have we know they're going to change, but they're the best we have right now. And, it would be great if we could use the most current data, but, we're using 2-year historical data. It's what we got.
Thanks so much. So now we can move into general discussion on the formula and modeling. In order to maybe narrow it down and get this item wrapped up, if directors could first maybe comment on your level of comfortability with the overall formula approach, to give maybe possibly your blessing to that work. And then if there's one of these scenarios that you're more in alignment with, if we could provide that direction to the staff team, that would be very helpful. So who would like to go first? Director Block.
I think BL starts before anybody else, right? So I think based on what I've heard from Craig and what we've discussed, I don't have a problem going with his population emphasis. That seems to be how he is, the way that he's leaning, and I don't think he'd steer us wrong.
Thank you, Director Block. I can also just go around the horn. Director Frommer.
Yes, I agree. I'm most comfortable with the population emphasis.
I agree as well. Thank you.
All right, I have a question. I'll say that coming in today, I was leaning more towards the balanced approach, but hearing the information and the discussion and the depth of the information and the analysis that you've all done, I can get behind the population emphasis one as well. I do have a question, and again, this may be more of a future consideration. I want to be careful about inadvertently incentivizing growth from a population standpoint. And so growth in the terms of sprawl versus growth in terms of infill and redevelopment. And so again, it's not something we need to solve for today because the numbers we have are what we have. But if there is a way, perhaps over time, to give more consideration to population density as communities have more time to put in place TOD type policies and see that actually come to fruition through infill and redevelopment, I think trying to incentivize that some way through this would be helpful versus just you get more money the more and more you grow, and you may not be growing in a sustainable way. So that could just be a more of an unintended piece for the future to keep in mind. But given the comparisons today, the data that we have, the fact that we need to do something now for 2026, I can get behind the population emphasis approach. And I do want to clarify, I guess, the decisions that we're reaching are specifically for FY26, and we'll come back and have another look at this and kind of learn from how it's going before decisions are made on FY27. Is that correct?
Mind if I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah, so thank you, Director Bracke. There's a couple things in there. First of all, yeah, I think we're just making the decision for FY26. However, and this will get into once we get past this portion of it when I talk about the NOFA, like I need something to have agencies so they know in the next few years what's the range of funding they're getting. So, you know, I feel like unless we think that we might do something radically different in FY27, but where we think, yeah, we're generally heading in the right direction, then I can give agencies estimates of what they'll have in 27 and 28, and they can use that to tell us what they're going to do with the money. So we're in this sort of chicken and egg thing where we need to be able to give the agencies decent information out beyond the first year so they can plan, but we're not going to have fully made those decisions yet. So I think we're striking that, you know, the good balance. You know, listening to your other comments about the population density, you know, I think in reality, like population density and the zoning factor are pretty interrelated. And again, as some new of the zoning related state legislation comes online, we might be able to do more of that. But, you know, I've been very clear with all the transit agencies that like, you know, we are learning as we go. We're standing this thing up. We're doing it really quickly. And I think the most important thing this year is just we get it stood up and working, and so the money's flowing and we can show success. And then we'll work down the road to improve the program, which may mean some changes in the way we address the formula. I mean, I could sort of see where again, the challenge with the density and the zoning is that yeah, it's really relevant in places like in the Front Range and, you know, some of the other large population areas. In the rural areas, like, And so, you know, how do we deal with that just sort of diversity of agencies that we're trying to support? And it could be that we end up, you know, creating another sub-program that's just focused on rewarding, you know, sort of density and zoning. And then we find a way to just allocate, okay, if you're eligible for that sort of sub-program pool, you know, we can allocate that out. I thought about that. I think the challenge is just the more you start doing things like that, the program gets more and more wonky and complex. So I think we got to balance trying to achieve the goals we want without not creating this sort of Frankenstein policy that 10 years from now, people are scratching their head, like, what the heck is that? But it's a thought, but it's, you know, I feel like, you know, to get this far in 5 months, we're doing pretty good. Let's, if we can get there and then worry about, or not worry about, but sort of dive into how we improve the effectiveness of some of these factors down the road, that's probably a natural evolution.
Thanks for that response. Would we maybe have an opportunity during the actual review of the grant applications and to take some of those other considerations? It's not going to necessarily be folks applied, they have a cap, therefore they get the money. If they're applying for something that's going to allow for you know, more sprawl, we could have some considerations at that time.
I think one of the things is we don't know what we're going to get from the agencies as we ask them about local planning and zoning. So, you know, we have zero database right now. So again, and I'll present this a little later, but as part of the NOFA, we're going to ask them to fill out a questionnaire and provide a narrative about what they're doing. And I think that can really inform, you know, our process next year to say like, okay, now we know what's reasonable and what's not. But I feel like right now we don't know what we don't know.
Thanks. Any comments from our online directors? Hearing none,
Sorry, I feel like I should support this. Yeah, I think the population approach is good. It feels a little weird for me to say that coming from a rural resort community that punches way above our weight with ridership that we do. And you know, over 1 million visitors a year come into the area. That doesn't count in the formula if we're just looking at population, but I understand the complexities of that. So I do support it. I don't know how else you do it. So I'm on board with that and comfortable with that approach.
all right, any other hands? Seeing none, I don't know that there was a direction request, not necessarily a formal motion, but what I'm hearing is just a general comfortability with the approach so far with support for the population emphasis. Have you gotten the direction that you need? Are you hoping for a formal vote from directors?
Yes, I would request a formal vote and said my recommendation would be that the board adopt the weighting associated with the population emphasis.
All right, do I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion to adopt the population emphasis formula.
I'll second.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Hearing none, motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. I think that's, it might not feel like that big of an achievement, but for me, it does. And hopefully for the board, it does. It's like the 1 hour here is reflective of probably about, 1,000 hours between me and the consultants, and the board really has been great working with it. So that's not a small, I've worked on this at the national level and stuff. It's, this is the ultimate sausage making of public policy. So I feel good about it. I hope the board does. I think we've got something very defensible and meaningful out of the gate. So, and we did it in 5 months. So great.
And we're ahead of schedule on the agenda. And we can celebrate at lunch. All right, next item is SB 230 Formula NOFA.
All right, no rest for the weary. So with the formula now approved, so I can now go in and start finalizing what I think allocations are going to be, and start moving with the NOFA process, which we're going to need to get all the agencies under contract. So this I'm not looking for a vote on, but I've kind of really fleshed out a lot more about how I think we go from where we are here to actually writing contracts, and just wanted to bounce some of these things off the board to see your thoughts. Some of this is maybe a little out of the box or innovative, because I think it's a different type of program. And some of it, we got to still make sure it'll work with both our contracting and legal, but I think generally it will. So I'm planning to release a NOFA for participation in the formula program sometime in late June. We plan to keep that open for at least 60 days. But given that this isn't like a lot of the other NOFA programs where agencies are sort of competing against each other on the viability of their project, or proposed project, I don't think we have to wait for all the submissions to come in. So I plan to do it on a rolling basis. And as agencies are ready and submit, if they sort of pass all the tests and check the boxes we have, we can go directly to contract. We may need to have, wait till the end to fill in the actual dollar amount, but we also may be able to just go use what we've got, and said if there's some extra left over, we use that for contingency or roll into 27. I think whatever gets us going as quick as possible. I am working on a consultant contract so that we'll be able to provide support to the transit agencies in responding it. This will make a little bit more sense later on in this presentation, but they're going to have to do some challenging things to respond to the NOFA. So I said I think we'll have consultant support that can go out and work with the different agencies. And I think it's important to understand that the NOFA has a couple different purposes. So first, we want to assess agency readiness and establish the means for contracting. In a lot of ways, and the legislature has given this term, it was system optimization plan. Now it's a comprehensive operational analysis, or a COA. But basically, we want to see what the agency is going to do with the money and make sure that they're really ready to spend it. So the NOFA part of it will be to validate that. Second is we do still have to go and make sure that the data that's in the formula is accurate. I did find some errors in some of the NTD data. In some places, agencies don't report, and I've had to kind of grapple together the data through various means. So a sense is we'll let each agency take a look at the data we're using in the formula with us and make sure it's correct. And if they don't, we can go through a process and just reconcile it. I don't expect the big differences from that. And then third, I think we said we're trying to create a NOFA process that isn't a one-size-fits-all, that'll meet a lot of different agencies' needs. I think we've gotten through the eligible use of funds. By and large, we want folks to focus on greenhouse gas reduction. When I was doing the town halls, I was sort of emphasizing that agencies that needed to just do some planning could use the funding for planning. I've since got some pushback on that from the governor's office in terms of concerns about, is that really meeting that greenhouse gas reduction effort? So I think we really are going to try and push agencies to use the money for either operations or capital investments that are directly tied to increased transit service, at least as much as possible. And then I think, doing things like marketing or promotions is just fine. So again, I've talked about this chicken and egg problem where I don't know exactly who's in the formula. So what I'd like to do is probably, in the next 2 weeks, is send out a request for letters of intent. And really, all this is going to be is ask agencies, do you plan to submit on the NOFA or not? So that way, if agencies aren't in, I can take them out of the formula, can get to closer estimates. If agencies don't, say they're going to, and then their board doesn't approve it, they have some issue, prefer that not to happen, but no harm, no foul, will, not a problem. But if agencies don't submit an LOI or say they're not going to submit, we are going to shut the door on that, and they won't be eligible to apply till 27. Don't be a jerk about it, but it'll really help the overall process if we can have more certainty about exactly who goes into the formula. One of the things that we heard during the town halls, Director Brackey, you were at all of them, was that there are agencies that are worried about having to come up with a match. And I think the board has actively, talked about like, yeah, we can find ways to provide some relief. But another thing that came out in the town halls is that several agencies may need to go to their board and get approval, and they're also going into their budget cycle in June, July. So they sort of need to know what that match requirement is going to be sooner than later. So what I'd like to do as part of that LOI, if you're an agency that wants to try and get match relief, request it then. Got to do some work to come up with what the criteria are for, that we'll consider in giving match relief. But they'll probably very much mirror what we use for the MMF program currently. But anyhow, they'll submit basically a narrative or whatever about we want relief, here's why. And very quickly, the CTE staff, me, go through, we'll probably put together a panel internally, review them, come up with our recommendations. And what I'd like to do is come to the June board meeting with recommendations and say, here are the agencies that requested match relief, and are we going to say, rather than 20%, it should be 10%, or we'll fully waive it. But we'll make those decisions then, and that way agencies go into the NOFA knowing exactly what commitment they have to make at a local level. I think that will streamline the process a lot. I think the local agencies will greatly appreciate that. One thing I said, I think it's important that we don't give a lot of rope on those waivers, though. It's 1 year, maybe 2 years, and then they'll have to come back and reapply. And I think we really encourage agencies to try and move beyond to being able to make the match, as we want the SB 230 money to try and leverage local efforts to raise funding as well. Okay. I guess I'll stop there for a second. Any questions about that sort of initial stuff we're doing?
Director Chaffee.
When you have talked with agencies, have you gotten any feedback on that 60-day application timeline? Is that going to be enough time for them to get what they need to together?
Good question. And I think the short answer is, yeah, there are some agencies that are like, there's no way we can get a COA together in 60 days. But if you can, that's why I plan to go to sort of this two-pronged approach where agencies don't necessarily, if agencies aren't ready for a COA can still apply. But I think without that COA requirement, I don't think any of the agencies perceive a big issue. That said, there were some agencies worried about being able to get board approval in time to do it. I think that if we can do the letter of interest and the match waiver up front, that will help preclude that. Also, I don't know that we really have to close it in 60 days. We could decide to keep it a little longer open. And my understanding is like we can say it's 60 days, and if we get to 45 days out and some agencies are really struggling to request, we could extend it without creating any real issues. Are you from, Okay. But yeah, I think if we can provide them relief on the COA, the other stuff is, a lot of it is really going to be like a 5311 submission. So I don't think it should be a big barrier. And if we get everything lined up so that they can plan to go to their boards in June, July, or August, they should have time to do it. They all know this is coming. They all know it's a lot of money. I think they'll find a way to do it.
Director Brackey.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate, being able to listen in on the town halls. And I feel like what you're bringing forward is really reflective of the input that you received and the suggestions from the service providers. So I feel like how you're kind of framing all of this is really helpful and responsive to what the input that was received. So hopefully, like you said, they know this is coming, they have this on their radar, and they're actively working to be ready to go and jump in and be able to participate right out of the gate. So thanks for the responsiveness.
Thanks. Any other questions, comments on the NOFA process? Director Frommer.
Yeah, this is a question that's more about the COA. So thinking about our RTD's COA, and it's not necessarily how much service they can deliver with CTE funds. It's sort of their larger vision, I think, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Are we talking like their larger vision for the transit service of the future, both with CTE funds and beyond, or this is what they're expecting to be able to provide with CTE funding?
Good question. I think we've mentioned several times, RTD is just sort of a different animal in this, this universe here. I don't think I think RTD is the one who pushed for the legislation to change the name from system optimization to COA. I don't know that it's going to do, me or the board much good if they give us a, 200-page plan and say, yeah, here it is. I think it really needs to be something that's much more catered to the program specific, where they're saying, here's what we're going to do with the money. I think we need to find out, though, still, how does this compare to their broader program? Like, they're increasing ridership here, but, is that on top of other increases that they already had planned? I think all that has to kind of get negotiated out. Like, it's just, again, it doesn't really fit itself to a generic approach that we're trying to use to everyone else. So, my thought is it's very much something we sit down with RTD, and I've requested this, that we sit down with them and just say, let's talk about how you're going to use the money and how we can show the legislature and the advocates for this bill that you guys are really using the money directly. But again, I think it's going to be sort of a one-off process that we do with RTD. I think when we get to other agencies, though, there's some gray area that we're going to have to work through. I think there are agencies that maybe we're about to lose a funding source and we're going to drop service. And without being able to use the SB 230 money, that we'll lose that transit service. Should that be eligible? We don't want to create incentives for agencies to drop local funding or something like that. On the other hand, if the only way that that service can be maintained is using SB 230, are we doing more harm if we don't allow them to use it? I don't know the answers yet, and I don't know what we're going to get, but we're going to have to work through that. Another issue, and this was brought up by someone at the CASTA conference that relates to this, is some of these agencies are experiencing significant inflation, like well beyond the growth in their current revenue sources. So even though that their current revenues and their operating budgets are still going up, they may not be able to maintain some service because of the delta between their increases and what the cost prices are doing. Should SB 230 funds be eligible to support those activities? I don't think this job's going to get easier. I think as we're reviewing these COAs, we're going to have to wrestle with some of those questions. And I don't know the answer really. I think we're figuring some of this out as we go, but we're going to have to make some other important policy decisions about how do we feel about some of these services that are in the gray. So really two answers. RTD, we've just got to sit down and figure it out and determine how can we really make sure the money's going where it is. But your question does bleed into some other issues I think we're going to have to wrestle with. And I think we're going to look at what's legal, what's the intent of the law, and what do we think is the best path to achieving greenhouse gas reduction.
One more, sorry to hold this up. You mentioned a couple of times now that we just need to sit down with RTD because they kind of are a different beast. What does that look like? Is that CDOT staff or is the board going to be involved in those conversations?
I I don't know if I know the answer to that, Director. I think initially it's probably it's CDOT staff. I think we have to break ground and just sort of see where things are. So I'm kind of making this up on the fly, but I think initially it's a staff meeting and we just find out what are they thinking, what are they willing to consider, and what are some of the big questions they got to deal with. And then I think from there that we need to decide, like, is that something where a board member, maybe set up like a ad hoc committee and we have a board member to part of that committee to just basically work through it? Does the governor's office need to be involved? I don't know yet, and I wish I had a better answer for you. And it does keep me from sleeping some nights because I don't think it's going to be a simple answer. And I don't want to beat on RTD. They've got their own issues and challenges. For us, this is like sort of all I'm focused on. They're fitting this into a much bigger program and set of challenges. So I think everyone has some issues to bring to the table that we got to work out. But I think we started as staff and then probably escalated to creating some type of ad hoc committee. But I think that let me maybe make that first foray, see where it goes, and then I think I could bring it back to the board and we can talk about where we go from there.
All right. If there are no more questions or comments on the NOFA approach.
Well, that was actually halfway.
Oh,
Actually, it won't be that long. I think we only got about 10 more
on
minutes.
the NOFA approach so far. All
But
right. What else you got for us?
Yeah, all right. So first of all, there's like agencies will choose. I want to submit. I know that like Colorado Springs and Metro Mountain Transit, they're ready to go. They know what they're going to do. I think we can get it real quickly. I tell them, here's how much money I think you're getting over the next few years. They put together a 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan is, probably details in 2 years and then last 3 years are maybe grouped. And we still need to decide this down the road, but we may decide that if that's good for 2 years and then come back and update your 5-year plan for the program. But they said, let's get through this and see what we get first before before I think we wrestle those questions. But again, call it a COA, an SOP, whatever you want. But really, I feel like what we need to know is what the heck are you going to do with the money and what benefit are we going to get it? So, are you planning to do market promotions? There's all the kind of different ways you can expand transit service, whether it's new routes, route extensions, increase frequency hours. Maybe there's other things that you can do that you think will really increase ridership. But tell us what those are. Describe what they are. What's the timeline for setting them up? What's the cost? Are you going to be reliant on other sources of funding? So say maybe you need other funding to buy a bus. Again, I think we're just trying to see, do you really have a viable plan to make this all work? And then we'd like to see some estimates of benefits. I suspect it won't be too hard for agencies to talk about maybe vehicle revenue mile increases that they'll have. Hopefully they can give us some estimates of increased ridership, but that may be more difficult. Again, I think this will evolve over time as we know more about how the program can impact their performance. So that's the ones that are ready to go. For the ones that aren't, created this idea of a deferred funding COA. And this is directly based on what we heard from some of the town halls. But, if an agency is like, well, we're interested, we think we can comply, but we're going to need 6 months, 9 months to do this COA, they still apply, don't submit a COA, but assuming they meet all the other eligibility requirements, we run the formula, say, okay, you're getting, say $100,000. We're going to, in effect, hold that in the bank for them. And then they're working on their COA. And as soon as they come back with a COA, it's acceptable, we approve it, then we can go to contract and move forward. But it takes some pressure off of them. And as I said, we'll have the consultant support that can come out and work with them. So they're, kind of helping them knock out the COA as well. So we think that approach has a couple of benefits. First of all, it takes this pressure off of them that Director Chafee was mentioning is like, are they going to be able to respond in time? Without the pressure to have to do the COA, we think so. Secondly, originally we were thinking they'd get the grant, be able to spend it on planning, and then once they're ready, they could move into operations. But as soon as we do that grant, the 2-year clock starts ticking on the grant. This way, that 2 year doesn't start until they've got an approved COA and are ready to go. So it gives them a lot more time to spend the money, and we think allow them to spend it better. Also, this way, really it'll be the broader CTE will have a contract, which I think will be a lot cheaper to have one contract than all these agencies having small, agreements. So we kind of centralize it, get a lot of economies of scale, and also it's a CTE spending money on planning, not all the agencies spending their SB 230. So I think it helps us really direct more of the money towards greenhouse gas reduction. Lastly, it's not in here, but by having it spread out the way we think it'll occur, with agencies coming in at different months, a few each month with their COA, it really reduces that one-time burden of getting all the contracts done. So it's that I think we'll be able to be much more responsive on getting the grant contracts awarded if it said they're sort of spread out. So this is kind of the big, and said I presented this at CASTA, made clear it was an idea at this point, but we got very good response to it. I think that a lot of agencies felt very much relieved. They're like, I can still get my money, but I'm not going to be spending all summer like up till midnight working and trying to get this done. I also think that by having us very involved in the development of COAs and having a consultant that's working with them, they don't have to, they can do it themselves, but they want to, we have the consultant come in and work with them. We'll get much better uniformity and quality in the plans that are getting developed. So that's the bifurcated COA approach, or NOFA approach. So that's kind of all I had. Like I said, unless the board has some real issues with this approach that we just laid out, we're just going to start, working towards getting the LOI out, figuring out our approach to the granting match relief, and so just getting the NOFA out there and try and move the program along.
Thanks, Craig. Any comments from directors on the COA approach to the NOFA? Here, Director Brackey.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, again, I think this approach is responsive, and having the two options will be really helpful for people. So thank you.
Director Jones, we got two options now. As I kind of mentioned to you earlier, I was like, I didn't know whether this meeting was going to take 15 minutes or 2 hours and not be anywhere. So I actually did pretty good.
Do you know me yet?
What's that?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know me yet?
Yeah. We've got 20 minutes left. We do have a presentation if you're interested. It's just more of an informational piece about the Bustang service. I don't know if you all know about it, but if you'd like to, Mr. DeRocher would be happy to do a quick presentation about it. If you'd like to just declare a victory and move on, we can just wrap up. But I think up to the board what you'd like to do.
Well, Paul, since you sat through this entire discussion and meeting, I would hate to be so rude as to tell you we don't want to hear from you. So I'm just going to take a point of privilege and say, yes, we're gonna hear from Paul.
Okay. Do you want me to, or I guess, do you have the slide materials, Craig, or
Yeah.
are you running the?
I think I do. 1 minute.
I chatted it to you this morning, so.
Give me 1 second, please.
Yep.
Why don't you go ahead and start talking, Paul? I'll get it up as you talk. All right.
Since we're a little bit ahead of schedule, would it be helpful if we took a little recess if folks need a restroom break? All right, how about we recess for 5 minutes for a break? Thanks. We'll be back here. How about, well, to be exact, what time is it? 11:43.
Go down to drive. Sorry, scroll down. Hello? You need to actually do it up there. Yeah. I was trying to avoid that. Oh. Maybe say 5 minutes or something?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I realize it. They were something like right? I realized it this morning. Okay. Everyone's coming in and talking in my office. I was like, I'll make it.
All right, folks, it's 11:43. Now we're behind schedule by 3 minutes. Folks could take their seats. All right. Paul, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So for those who I haven't met, I'm Paul DeRocher. I'm the Director of the Division of Transit and Rail here at CDOT. And we operate the Bustang service, which has been around for about 10 years, started in 2015. And the Outrider service was kind of shortly on its heels, but I'll give you just a brief overview of the services. One thing that some of you may or may not have been involved with or heard about was that back in 2022, the Bustang mainline services, so that's the service that runs up and down I-25 and then out I-70 to the west, was provided an amazing opportunity through SB 22-180 to expand service from kind of more of a base level service to really double and triple the amount of service over a 3-year period. And if you're doing the math, 2022 minus or 25 minus 22, that's 3 years. So we are right at the end of that pilot period, and it's something that we are really thinking a lot about and pulling together about how we're going to be able to sustain those services into the future. And so with Snowstang, this is another really, really popular service that goes direct from Union Station, making stops along I-70 to several resorts that we have partnerships with. In fact, they pay for about half of the amount of service that we deliver to these resorts. So it's a great door-to-door way for people to avoid parking at the resorts. And so for those of you who are skiers or snowboarders, you know that the resorts are catching on, that parking's running out. And so one way for them to kind of address this is by charging users to use that parking. And so for people who want to avoid paying for parking, this is a great option. And then lastly, Bustang to Estes Park. Estes Park is and Rocky Mountain National Park, one of the crown jewels of the state. And people know about it. So if you're trying to get to Estes Park in the summertime, it's not always that easy. And so this service goes direct from Union Station up US 36 to Estes and into the park. And so again, kind of helping folks to avoid the need to fight traffic, find parking, pay for parking, and at a pretty affordable price in this particular instance to Estes Park is a $15 round trip. So I think really, you know, the main message, and I think part of what I think is helpful for the board to understand is that Bustang in particular, that pilot expansion is really about a lot of the themes and that you all are deliberating about how improving the level of service has a direct correlation to the response for ridership. And so that's kind of a common transit principle that we see as you increase service, people respond and they start using it more because it's easier. And so kind of our statewide network here, you can see, again, I mentioned Bustang mainline running up and down I-25 and then out I-70. You see that kind of depicted here in the map. The smaller lines, more multicolored, that's really a part of our Outrider network. And the Outrider network is differentiated from the mainline network in the sense that it is really about providing service to rural areas and connecting those rural areas to population centers. So you can see here, Director Averill, I know, is very familiar with the Durango to Grand Junction route. So that's connecting a lot of smaller rural communities to Grand Junction and Durango, where you have kind of access to human and social services, medical services, and other things that may not be available in rural areas. And so the 5311F program that provides about 15% of this particular aspect of busing is really directly focused on connecting rural areas to those urban areas. What's not shown here, and I think what a lot of folks really are cued into, is the fact that we have all of these amazing rural network providers. Don from La Junta, Director Block from La Junta is here, really representing one of what are these small but mighty, and the largest rural transit network in the country exists in Colorado. So this whole network is really about weaving a tapestry of connectivity via transit. And so Outrider and Bustang are about connecting those smaller systems throughout the state. So I mentioned kind of the SB 180 and how that has impacted service. What we saw between this, and this is just between fiscal years 24 and 25. So obviously we're not concluded with fiscal year 25 yet, but I think what you see here is about a 20% increase system-wide in Bustang from last year to this year. And so I think, again, it really underscores a lot of the work that this board is undertaking in providing opportunities for agencies to increase service. Bustang really saw a direct response and really a success in how the market responded to that increased service. And if you pick this apart a little bit, you can see the West Line was really kind of our all-star here, where that was actually a 32% increase on the West Line in ridership. And so we went from approximately 6 round trips on West Line to 15 round trips on the West Line, and expanding the run all the way from Glenwood to Grand Junction. And so we're not only increasing the service levels, but also the amount of area that we're able to cover. But the North and the South Line weren't far behind. And so North Line and South Line tend to act a little bit more like commuter services. So folks coming from Fort Collins, Loveland into Denver for work purposes. So we saw a really great response there. What's not shown here is that we also added several mobility hubs that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But that helps to increase the efficiency of how Bustang operates. So one in particular at Centera Loveland is a direct connection to our express lanes on I-25 to a center loading platform, and then directly back onto the express lanes where the Bustang is traveling. So really, if you're familiar with the concept of bus rapid transit, it is very much in that space. So the bus is not having to exit off of an interchange and take time to delay in picking up passengers and coming off of the interchange. So moving along, kind of talking more about those mobility hubs, we have a few that are in the works now. The city of Lone Tree is in partnership with the CDOT. In fact, our Region 1 team is really leading this program, where we're implementing a new mobility hub there. It's, as you can see here, a lot of infrastructure is going to be added to help people achieve not only better connectivity to transit, but also connecting to local trails as well. So you see sort of ancillary benefits. Of course, any transit user is also a pedestrian or cyclist or other type of mobility to get from that station area to their final destination. And so this is one that is going to be kicking off here very soon. I believe we actually had the groundbreaking, or will be having the groundbreaking here very soon on that project. And then we have a groundbreaking coming up just maybe next week, actually, for the mobility hub at Broomfield and Thornton. So this is at Highway 7 and I-25. This is a slightly smaller program, but still achieves that same effect, where the bus can take the interchange, be able to use some of these slip ramps on directly on the interchange and then get right back onto the expressway. So again, we're really trying to drive down the travel time and make transit ridership be competitive with driving alone. So reducing those kind of off mainline trips or off the interstate trips is really helpful to that end. So other busing projects of note, we are working on improving the app that we have for busing and Outrider. Right now, they're two separate apps. There aren't reservation opportunities available there. We've heard that loud and clear from the public. They want that option. So we're actually working with another transit agency right now to develop a new app that'll hopefully be delivered in August or September. And also will provide an opportunity for employer-sponsored transit pass options, much like EcoPass. And then we're also working on procurement. So we have been improving our fleet over time. I mentioned 10 years the busing system has been in operation. Every day these buses are putting literally thousands of miles on them. And so we have to replace those buses, and we've got a few orders coming through. This will be the first time that we've ordered with some of the new tariffs and things like that. So you can use us as a guinea pig and see how that goes. But we'll be starting that procurement here very soon. And then El Rancho, which is a park and ride on I-70, kind of in the Evergreen area, will be opening in the May timeframe. So talked a little bit about Outrider real quick, and I know we're kind of running on time, so I'm going to run through this quickly. But you know, again, the Outrider network is really about connecting rural areas to services in urban areas, and so that's a little bit different. You know, we don't have the same degree of frequency that we see on the mainline services on I-25 and I-70. But again, we see great response from this, and really it's a beloved system. When you go out and talk with people about this, it is one that if it didn't exist, you know, people really get upset, you know, when you start talking about service changes and things like that. So it is one that we're working on increasing service on, and actually what you see here, or I'm sorry, what you see here is that we do have one route where we actually had so much ridership on it. We did have one route expansion that was between Crested Butte and Denver. So we did add a second trip there, but really you don't see the same amount of ridership increase for this service. But again, this is the same level of service. And again, in the context of what you all are talking about, you know, you're going to get the same, you know, kind of response if you're not adjusting or toggling service to help improve those outcomes. And so that's kind of what we see here. It still did show a modest 3% increase from 24 to 25. So we did see that. But I think some of the other improvements that we've made between Sterling and Denver, we added a stop at Denver International. So that's the first time ever Outrider or a Bustang service at all has ever made a direct connection to DIA. Or excuse me, DEN, they don't like it when you say DIA. And so talked about the second round trip between Crested Butte and Denver, and now we're stopping at Monarch Mountain. And I think one of the things that the I-70 and the Snowstang service has really taught us is that it's not just about commutes, is that people are actually interested in using transit for recreational trips too. And so having a stop on Monarch Mountain on that Crested Butte route is actually super helpful, because if you're in Salida, you're in Buena Vista, you want to get to Monarch Mountain, this is an opportunity for you now. And then just lastly, we are working on several stop upgrades through the state for the entire Outrider system. You know, this system was really kind of started on a shoestring in a lot of ways. Greyhound kind of retracted from the Colorado market, and the state of Colorado stepped in and said, we will provide this service. And so a lot of the stops were kind of made on a shoestring in partnership with, say, a gas station or something like that. And what we're really trying to do is go through and formalize these stops, improve accessibility, achieve ADA compliance, and other things like that. So that's moving forward. And the last thing I'll just close with here is we have a study that's ongoing that's looking at this entire statewide network. It's called the Transit Connection Study. We have a draft report coming out later this month in draft form that we'll be reviewing, and really kind of more in final draft form in June. that we're just, again, looking across the entire state. How do we improve the connectivity and build on the success that we've already established with bus staying? And so some great recommendations to be considered there, both with our Transportation Commission as well as stakeholders. There will be opportunities to engage in the draft sort of stage to provide input to those recommendations. And yeah, again, final report coming out in June. So hopefully I didn't run through that too fast. Happy to answer any questions, and I guess in the 3 minutes we have remaining.
Very strategic. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
I know that there might be some itching questions, but it looks like there's some opportunities to engage with additional planning. But maybe if the directors could keep to the most important question for Paul, just to stay on time. Or ask over, are you joining us for lunch?
I can be around. Absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
Director Brackey.
Oh, well, thanks for the quick update. I just was wondering if we could get an update on your new transit connections plan at one of our future CTE meetings.
Yeah, so we are planned to go to the Transportation Commission in June. And I think, you know, we would have materials prepared at that point. So let me kind of maybe work with Kay and Sally and see how is the best way to strategize that.
Director Frommer. Sorry.
I think my questions are going to take a while to answer. But I guess if you can go back to the slide that shows the monthly ridership for the north, south, and west.
Mhm.
Just wondering if you could like offer any more of a story behind some of these trends. Like for the west line, did you just add a bunch of service in December? And was the uptake or was the corresponding ridership increase really that immediate?
Yeah, so I guess the quick backstory is, so SB 180 was about increasing service. And I actually think this is somewhat instructive for you all as well, is that as you start to hear from transit agencies about how they're going to increase service, there's also that first step of, well, we need to get the vehicles, we need to get the drivers, we need to kind of accumulate the resources to institute that. And we were no different in that regard. We initiated a procurement for vehicles. And for those of you who know, the procurement timeline for starting a vehicle order to receiving it was really kind of stretched out during the pandemic and really hasn't recovered too well up to now. So actually in December was the full sort of implementation of the plan, but we were implementing service sort of incrementally up to that point as we received new vehicles. We ordered 25 new vehicles in order to achieve this service level increase. So it wasn't a exact turn on for all 3 times as much service starting in December of last year. It was an incremental increase, but there was a big kick up in December for our ridership on the West line. I think as we were able to kind of achieve that final piece, I believe there was 5 trips added, 5 round trips added on the West line in December, and you can kind of see similarly on the other lines. And we also did a lot of marketing for that as well, as you would imagine. We put a lot of funding into this, and so we wanted people to know. So a lot of billboards on I-70, I-25, actually on the vehicles themselves, working with, other traditional and non-traditional marketing opportunities. Yep. Yeah, it's about 30%. So it's significant. Yeah.
Any other questions from other directors? Then I have, I'll do my final comment and a question. If you go to your last slide. Really, not that last slide. Really excited to see that the South Park folks are involved in our marketing and branding to really draw in millennial riders.
You'd be amazed with AI.
That is really thoughtful. And also a question on the EcoPass comment. Do you have a timeline of when such a program might be available? It looks like you're still working on contracting with an app.
Yeah, I should be clear. So the app makes that an opportunity. We don't necessarily have plans for an employer pass necessarily, but the app makes it an avenue we can pursue.
And will this be similar to the RTD app?
Yeah, I'd say that's a decent corollary. Sure.
All right, great, thanks. All right, now we can move on to next steps, closing comments.
Sure, thank you. I don't know if I have a slide, I don't need a slide for it. Anyhow, thank you again for making the decision on the formula program. That just feels like a great achievement for us all, so I'm pretty happy about that. Next month, like I said, as we talked about, I anticipate we'll be in the throes of the NOFA, and hopefully I'll be bringing recommendations to you about how we'll treat agencies that are looking for matching requirement. And then I also think we'll likely be talking about some of the things related to passenger rail in terms of maybe perhaps considering the IGA and some type of commitments. That's going to be the focus of the workshop this afternoon. And then at some point, we also probably need to start talking about the discretionary grant program, part of which can focus on mobility hubs, which has a great tie-in with the bus staying. So Paul's presentation was very timely. Thank you, Paul. But I'd like to thank you all for making it here today. The last thing is assuming we like the in-person meeting, one thought was to try and do a meeting in September or October in conjunction with the CASTA meeting in, I think it's in Avon. So we may be looking at doing that. With that, back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Craig. I don't know if there are no more items. I'm happy to adjourn the meeting so we can get on to lunch. Yes, please eat and then stay. Yeah, we have another meeting after this.
You may make one comment. I had to make one change in the slides. I think people might have been a little confused. The pie chart one, I realized at about 8:15 this morning that I had an error in there. So I had switched out the slide that I presented. We will put the new slide in the packet, in the what's on the website.
All right, thanks. All right, meeting adjourned. Let's eat.